It is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Aditi Barghava, a professor at UC San Francisco with 34 years of research experience. She is an integrated physiologist, and her primary area of research is molecular neuroendocrinology. She has over 70 peer-reviewed publications and serves on the editorial board of biological sciences journals. Aditi's research group investigates the molecular basis for stress-related disorders. Aditi and her team focus on understanding how mRNA therapeutics, such as those in the vaccines, work in the cells. Since the start of the COVID pandemic, the major effort is now to ascertain vaccine safety and mental health status by surveying people's response to vaccine efficacy and safety in an unbiased manner. This is her PROVES survey that many of you have already filled out, I hope. In November 2022, Aditi gave a very compelling expert testimony at US Senator Ron Johnson's panel discussion in Washington, DC, where she first learned about COVID-19 vaccine injuries and met Brianne Dressen as well as other people suffering from COVID-19 vaccine injuries. Aditi has been emphasizing the importance of natural immunity and the flaws with SARS-CoV-2 vaccine trials, and has faced challenges with her career because of this. Please welcome Dr. Barghava.
Thank you for having me. So without much ado, let's start. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this will go well. Let's see if I... So do you see full screen or what do you see?
Mostly a full screen, like
okay,
recorded.
Okay, so I just do want to say this, I'm not representing UCSF in any capacity. This is my work, but and again, not an official spokesperson for UCSF. So as we know that COVID-19 coverage in some way has been pretty chaotic. And for a lot of topics, there's been a lot of obfuscation. At some points, it's also gotten very vitriolic, especially for the unvaccinated. And there's misinformation on both sides. And a lot of that information has also gotten mutated in translation. And again, both sides have thrived on fear, uncertainty, and sowed seeds of doubt, which has led to the situation that we are in right now. So I like to start with describing this scenario, which I think has become very apt for science and a lot of other situations. And this is a parable of 6 blind men and an elephant, so an old fable. So these blind men were very wise, very intelligent, but they became so full of themselves that the villagers were really tired of them, and they needed these men to be taught a lesson. So they went to another wise person and said, what can be done? And they said, so they, this person said to these 6 wise men that you all have to guess what this animal is going to be. And if you guess the identity of the animal right, then we will accept what you all say. And so these men were taken to this elephant and given just a portion of that animal to be felt. And then based on that, they had to predict what this animal could be. So as you can see, they were all assigned different parts of the elephant. the trunk, the tusk, the ear, the leg, the body, and the tail. And what they came up, the answers were that the tusk was a spear, the trunk was a snake, the ear was a fan, and the leg was a stump of a tree, the body was a wall, and the tail was a rope. And they each were confident that they were right, and that was it. There was nothing to be disputed about. So as you can see, that taking things out of context or looking at a very small part of the picture can lead to misinformation or misjudgment. And I feel that's what's being done with COVID and the science so far. So just very briefly, history is always important. And the human coronavirus was actually first identified in 1964 by Dr. June Almeida. And she was asked to actually look at these cold samples from nasal samples from a medical student who had this flu-like symptoms but didn't have flu. And it turned out that when she identified these viral particles, they looked like what's shown here with these little spikes of corona, and hence they were called corona viruses. And she had actually noted these kind of similar viral particles while she was studying hepatitis and mice and bronchitis in chicken. And she tried to actually publish this, and they had told her that her images were not very good and not publication quality, and rejected her work. But as you can see that she stayed the course, and in 1980, she also helped to take electron microscopy pictures of HIV/AIDS. But what that tells you also is that, of course, while working with this human coronavirus, she herself did not get infected. And human coronaviruses have been around for much longer than we've known about. So what I want to do is then briefly touch about natural versus vaccine-induced immunities and what's been the signal versus noise in this field. So vaccines can be made against viruses or bacteria. So viruses are either DNA viruses or RNA viruses. And bacteria can cause diseases as well, such as pneumonia or meningitis. So there are several different kinds of vaccines that have existed, and some of them are newer ones, as we've seen with COVID vaccines. So just a little background about most commonly used vaccines, which are live or attenuated or heat inactivated or killed viral vaccines. So what they are is that you just take the virus and you either weaken them, which is attenuation, or you heat inactivate and kill them, and then you just give a bolus of that virus. And so how does this attenuation process happens is that you take a virus, which will be in this case human measles virus or mumps or chickenpox virus, and typically they're then grown in chicken eggs. And when they, the first time they're grown, chicken is not their host, so it's difficult to grow them, but they adapt, and whatever virus particles you recover, you again grow them in the next round of chicken eggs, and then so on and so forth. And by the time you go through 15, 16 passages, the virus then adapts and no longer thinks of human as its host, but now the chicken is its new host. So it's acquired, or you would then, if it actually escaped, it would be like a zoonotic jump from human to chicken. And then that virus, after passaging it for 15 or 16 times, can no longer actually grow in humans with the same capacity as the very first isolate that was taken, and then that's then used to make or give you a live attenuated vaccine. Similarly, you have other from bacteria, some of the toxoids that the bacteria produce for the tetanus and things like that, that are then given as conjugates to evoke an immune response. And then there are other viruses or bacteria for which you have a part of their protein given either as a recombinant, which means they're fused to something else. That's why it's a recombinant. In some cases, it could be fused to a virus, so the bacterial portion is fused to a virus, or to some other protein that will then evoke an immune response. So these were the more classical vaccines that have been used, and as we know, they've been pretty effective for the diseases listed here. The other thing to note is that a lot of these diseases are also childhood diseases, which are measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, polio, but the other ones are not childhood diseases. So the success of vaccines that are for childhood diseases is far greater than those for the diseases that happen in adulthood or later in life. There's also a difference in some of these, which I'll touch upon a little bit later. And then we have these new vaccines that have come up. For example, the vaccines for shingles. Initially, it was a live attenuated vaccine, just like in the past. But what happens with these live attenuated vaccines is that people who are immunocompromised, they of course don't have such a robust immune system, and then they can actually get the disease. Therefore, those people cannot be given this kind of vaccination. So for shingles vaccine, more recently, they had come up with a recombinant vaccine, which means they took part of the virus and then fused it with another virus, which is called an adeno-associated virus, and used this virus to make parts of the zoster virus, or the chickenpox virus in this case. And that then works as a vaccine, which is what they've also done for COVID. And similarly for human papillomavirus, it's a recombinant vaccine. So like I mentioned, vaccines against childhood diseases are much more effective than what you see for adult diseases, but that doesn't mean that they are 100% effective either. So as we know, if you get chickenpox when you're a child, then the chances of your getting chickenpox or a severe bout of chickenpox again is almost nothing. It's not reported anymore, any severe cases, with the exception that if you do get your first chickenpox case at a very young age, which is younger than 6 months old, when your immune system is not as well developed, then you may again get chickenpox. Chickenpox vaccines, as shown here, they've been fairly effective, and effectiveness is about 72%. And we know that people who get this vaccine normally don't it's 72% effective. So about 30% people will get breakthrough infections, or if they do get that infection, then it's a much milder disease than if they were not vaccinated. So for SARS vaccine, as we saw, development of all these other vaccines have taken years and years, and clinical trials happen for years. And it doesn't mean that these vaccines were safe in the very first go. There have been many iterations before these vaccines were deployed at mass scale. But as we saw with the coronavirus vaccines, within a span of a year, we had several vaccines that were in phase 1, and even before phase 3 were completed, they were all authorized and approved and used under emergency use authorization. And more recently, BioNTech and Pfizer's same mRNA vaccine under the brand of Comirnaty has been approved. So let's just very briefly talk about, or try and get some idea about how the immune system works in terms of evoking either immunity or if you have an infection, which is not a viral infection or any other infection, or even if you have a wound or a cut, how does all that work? So here are some of the major immune organs that are present in our body are listed. And of these, some are more important than the others in some ways. So there's the bone marrow, which produces all your immune cells. And then there are two other organs, thymus and the spleen, thymus being the next most important organ that does most of your immune cell training. And then all the secondary training are done by these other secondary lymphoid organs, such as the spleen or other lymph nodes that are present all around in different parts of your body. Now, adenoids and tonsils, most people ignore them, but these lymphoid organs are extremely important for combating respiratory illnesses. So again, in some years ago, tonsils were not thought to do anything. And if you had inflamed tonsils, they were taken out. But more recently, after several decades of having thought that tonsils didn't play an important role, there've been some studies done to look at the role of, or in people where their tonsils have been removed, and they find that if tonsils are removed, the likelihood of people suffering from upper respiratory tract illnesses increases anywhere between 2 to 3-fold. And if your adenoids are removed, then it's actually 8-fold. So things, science changes, and obviously now based on that, it's not recommended that tonsils or adenoids be removed. And in cases where both of these are removed, then people can have be very severely compromised in dealing with upper respiratory tract infections. And so just to put it in perspective, we have over 500,000 children in the US who get their tonsils removed even today. So they are automatically compromised in dealing with respiratory infections. Just keep that in mind. So immune cells, all of them, they're produced in bone marrow. And before they get mature, they're basically your stem cells. And these stem cells can go through 2 different fates. So they can then go through this myeloid fate or the lymphoid fate, and people may have heard of those. I'm not sure about the background of a lot of you. So if I use too much jargon, please feel free to stop me or ask for clarification. So these myeloid, if the stem cells take this fate of myeloid cell type, then it's going to get basically divided into these different mature immune cells, which are your monocytes, neutrophils, basophils, platelets, and I'm sure all of you have heard of these. And all of them have their specific functions that they do. And if they are of the lymphoid lineage, then they can get further divided into either a T cell fate or a B cell fate. So the T cells and the B cells are part of your adaptive immunity, and these other cells are part of your innate immunity. So your innate immunity is like your these soldiers that are constantly doing surveillance, and if they find any infective material, so if you get a viral or a bacterial infection, they're going to find that, eat it, and or destroy it, and then take parts of that to then go and actually train your T cells to for either memory and future immunity, and then the T cells then in turn train the B cells to make antibodies. So the T cells cannot really perform their function without being educated in thymus, and this is called thymic education. So thymus is one of your most important lymph organ, and interestingly, in humans, the thymus actually what we call involutes, or it atrophies or becomes smaller as we age. So thymic function is best when we are young, and as we age, especially after age of 50, thymic function is much more reduced, and it's not going to train new cells. So it's like saying that you can't teach an old dog a new trick. The other thing is that this thymic education is in some ways, it's like a black box. Getting cells that go and get educated in thymus is more difficult than getting admission in an Ivy League school. So, but once these stem cells from bone marrow make it to the thymus, then there are several steps that happen before these T cells are released from the thymus to then go and train the B cells in your secondary lymphoid organs. So this naive T cell is first presented with parts of either bacteria or viruses by these other, the macrophages or the platelets or other of those cells that we looked at, neutrophils, which would have gobbled up or eaten parts of the viruses or bacteria that had infected us. And once it presents that part of the virus or bacteria, which could be any part, it could be their DNA, it could be their RNA, it could be their protein, it could be other parts of the viruses or bacteria. And the T cell has to recognize that as a non-self. And if it makes a mistake and does not recognize it as non-self, then that T cell is actually killed. But if it is successful in recognizing that as non-self, then it goes to the next step, where it is then presented with something which is self. So that means that it's something that belongs to you. And so it knows not to attack our own cell types or our own DNA. And if that education fails, then you get autoimmunity, right? Where your immune cells start attacking your own cells in case of several autoimmune diseases such as MS, multiple sclerosis, or rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. So again, that training is extremely important. And once that non-self and self training happens, these naive T cells are no longer naive. They're given, if you like, different kinds of weapons or proteins that they express, or they're called markers. Again, some of you may have heard of it. CD4, CD8, CD16, CD32, all the numbers you can throw out. So different T cells get different markers, and all those markers basically define what function they're going to play. And there are several steps that these T cells have to go through before they become fully functional. So if they make mistakes at any of those points, then again, there are checks and balances, and they are eliminated or killed. And if that, again, process is faulty, then we do have autoimmune kind of diseases. So if all that training goes well, then some of these T cells become T helper cells. And again, there are different kinds of those, Th type 1, type 2, 17, or Treg cells. And these are all, like I said, memory cells. And then some of them become cytotoxic T cells. That means they are ready to just go and kill without any further training or recruiting any other cell types. but these T memory cells are the ones that then will retain long-term memory. So therefore, when all this exposure happens when we are younger or in childhood, when our thymuses are fully functional, haven't involuted, then the more exposure you have, the more to different kinds of infectious material, then the more repertoire of T cells, memory T cells, we will make and keep. So the second part of this education is that those T cells then go to these different lymphoid organs, which, like I said, which could be spleen, which could be your Peyer's patch, which could be appendix, which could be your tonsils, which could be your lymphoid. And there, the B cells are then presented with these, by the T cells to make antibodies in large amounts. And then those antibodies are the ones that will actually take care of the infectious material. So, as you can see, this involves several steps, and it's not a process that can happen in 1 day or 2 days. It takes a couple of weeks before we get all this training to happen. But once this training has happened and your memory T cells are present, and if you were to get reinfection, then that whole thymic education does not have to happen. Those memory T cells that were there, they will bypass all that step, go directly to the B cells, and the B cells will then produce huge amounts of antibodies to take care of infection, and therefore you may not actually have a successful infection on subsequent exposures. So as I mentioned, that this thymic function decreases with age, and as you can see, once we cross 50, our thymic function is really compromised. So how would vaccines help us? So again, when you are younger and you give or you get a vaccine, then the vaccine, which is mostly in the past has been virus or bacterial portions of the infectious material, that's recognized by your immune cells, goes through thymic education, and then gives you long-term memory for childhood diseases. But in other cases, such as influenza and flu viruses, it never, even if you get it in childhood, your immune system does not train you for a lifelong immunity. So the immune system, for whatever reason, has this compartment, if you like, where it discerns that for certain viruses, whether they are RNA viruses or DNA viruses, if they are your diseases of childhood diseases, then you get more long-term immunity, probably because of your thymic education. But there too, it's not necessary that if for influenza that you would get lifelong immunity. So coming to this COVID vaccine, especially the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. So how is that different? And why are these called mRNA vaccines? So the virus, in this case, the SARS-CoV virus is an RNA virus. And so what that means is that when it goes into your cell, our cells don't have the capacity to work with the viral RNAs in the way that we can work with our own DNA and RNA. So that viral RNA, basically the virus hijacks our cell's machinery to make its own proteins. So in this case, in principle, the technology is brilliant, if you like, but in practice, the selection of target is very important. But working with mRNA, so it's called an mRNA because it's a message. So normally when you have DNA, it's made or transcribed into mRNA. So because it's the message from DNA, and that message is going to be converted into protein. So there are several steps in here. So this mRNA itself has to be of a special kind for it to be recognized by our cell to make protein. So what it has on its one end is this structure which we call a cap. It's a 5' cap. And at the other end, which we call the 3' end, it has what we call a poly A tail. And these two structures are very important to distinguish a specific class of, so there are different classes of RNAs, but if the RNA has these caps and tails, then they're called mRNA. They also are obviously carrying messages that can be translated into protein, but the RNA will not be used as a template to make protein unless they have these 5' cap and poly A tail in human cells or in eukaryotic cells. That it's different in bacterial cells and other non-eukaryotes. So, so this particular mRNA vaccine has this 5' cap and a 3' poly A tail. But these two structures are extremely fragile. So that means if we handle them, they actually can fall off from the message. And if they fall off, then this message in some ways is useless. And when we do this kind of experiment in the lab, or we are giving these constructs in cells, we don't really care if these structures have fallen off from some percent of the mRNA, because those mRNA will not be translated. But you know, we're not really looking at the side effects from these molecules which are not completely intact, as we're really only interested in looking at the protein, and then we look at function in a very short window, and then and that's pretty much it. But that doesn't happen when we are translating it in for therapeutic purposes, and that's why I say that even though it's a powerful technique, we don't fully understand it, because the way the viruses hijack our system, they are specialized to do that. We are not, we don't understand it. So here I've sort of just tried to draw some of the reasons why these mRNAs could be, vaccines could be giving these adverse events, or they may not work with the way that ideally they should be working. So like I said, there's that cap and the mRNA and poly A tail, and if everything is completely ideal, then you have this process of translation and it'll make that protein. So in this case, it's a spike protein. And but when mRNA is made by your cells from your DNA template, or when the virus is infected, they have other machineries to take care of that. They have this quality control. If the mRNA is not capped properly or doesn't get tailed properly, then that mRNA is actually degraded or not translated. But all those quality control checks are not available for something that you give exogenously. So the other issue is that this mRNA is actually encapsulated in these PEG lipid particles, or in cholesterol lipid particles called nanoparticles. And it's something like, you can imagine if you were to take a soap solution and blow bubbles, then the bubbles are not of the same size. So when we mix these mRNA with the lipid or the cholesterol to encapsulate it, because without that encapsulation, this mRNA will not be protected when it's given as an injection. So something needs to protect it. So because the sizes are different, the amount of mRNA that is in each of these nanoparticles is different. So now if you were to take this nanoparticle and you say that you have a concentration of some amount, when you dilute it, we don't know if in that subsequent dilution, whether some of, because of this heterogeneity in size, you cannot be completely sure of the concentration that's being given after dilution. So when they say that they gave you 30 micrograms of the dose, it could be 30, it could be 10, it could be 0, it could be 100. We really don't know. And to me, that was one of the biggest flaws of the delivery system. Similarly, when they said for Moderna that they were giving you 100 micrograms or giving us 100 micrograms, who knows what was being given. The other issue is that this lipid particle is also, when you take it from -80 where it was stored and bring it down to room temperature, this can actually rupture. So if it ruptures, then what we are left with is this naked molecule, and that naked molecule is very labile, or it can be degraded very quickly. So again, it's possible that in some people, if that process was not followed properly, that perhaps they never got the dose, and so no side effect. Or in some people where this concentration was too much, there was a more severe side effect. This just sort of tells you if this mRNA was, under ideal condition, would be translated, and they've made it against spike proteins. So spike proteins will be made, and those spike proteins will be then recognized by your, they're saying it's going to bypass your whole T cell training and will be presented directly to the B cells, and they'll make antibodies, and therefore you have some protection. So that's more of your adaptive immune response. However, in reality, I don't think it really works like that. We have no idea, like I said, about the quality of the mRNA, whether it's partially degraded, whether the cap falls off, whether the tail falls off. And if that happens, then your other immune cells, which are neutrophils or other kind of immune cells, will then take it as foreign or non-self RNA, and then they can take it to your thymus and then go through the whole thymic education and actually work through your innate immune response. So it will then feed back to this. And in that case, if you may get a longer term protection if this pathway is activated. But if it's solely this pathway, then it's a very short-term protection, and it doesn't seem to be a very good effective vaccine, because as we know in the past, it has been a viral vaccine which will go through this whole pathway and probably evoke more long-term immune responses. So the other component of that is that when you get a whole live attenuated virus as a vaccine, or a dead virus as a vaccine, then you have all components of the virus. And like I said, those immune cells that are in your, like the neutrophils, etc., they will, when they phagocytose or kill the viral particle, they can engulf or present in your thymus any of these portions of the virus, or more than one portion of the virus. So you will make antibodies to probably several of these portions of the virus. And therefore, the next time the virus comes, even if it's mutated, in most cases, the mutation, as we see, happens in the spike protein or the outer region of the virus, but you have antibodies to other part of the virus. And so it doesn't matter if this is mutated, because your natural immunity, which is against these other parts of the virus, will then help fight off the virus. So this is a very small component of your natural immunity. And so that's the other part that's been overlooked, that studies are showing that in after COVID infection in unvaccinated people, spike is only 20% of the response, antibodies to spike. All these other components are very crucial in making antibodies as well. So, but the vaccine is only giving you protection against the spike protein. So if the virus mutates, then that antibody is no longer useful, because the antibody is very specific to the shape of that spike protein. And by mutating, it's actually changing that shape. So it's like saying that you had a key for a specific lock, but now the lock has been changed, so the key is not going to fit. So your antibodies are sort of useless. But these other parts of the viruses don't mutate as often. And so if you were naturally infected without vaccines, you have antibodies to all of these. So it doesn't matter if this part is changed, because you can still use all these keys to enter, or in this case, destroy the virus or the infection. So the other part of it is that because some of the other viruses also very closely resemble in the family the coronaviruses. So if you get infected with other closely related viruses, then your natural immunity will also protect you or provide you with cross protection. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. So interestingly, when all this was being presented to the FDA and by the panels, the then deputy director of FDA actually made the statement that widespread deployment of a weakly effective COVID-19 vaccine could result in more harm than good. And it's going to provide us with false sense of security, and it will interfere with measures to reduce COVID-2 transmission. So initially, when I was following this, I was actually quite encouraged by listening to these kind of messages, and had hope that vaccines that were not going to be effective will not be deployed. But suddenly things changed between October and January, and we had approval or emergency use approval of, in my mind, very weakly effective vaccines which had not been tested. So here's some data that from people who've been vaccinated with Pfizer or Moderna vaccine compared to people who had natural immunity. And again, these are sound bites that get picked up, but when you actually closely examine the data, you can see what the flaws are here. So for example, the data that they're showing in terms of antibody production, they're only measuring, like I said, spike protein. So in naturally immune people, spike protein is a very small portion, but nonetheless, when you look at the concentration, is fairly comparable in people who were recently infected or recovering, which is 1.3 months. But in the vaccinated people, they've taken their serum only after 3 to 14 weeks. So the comparison between 3 to 14, I actually don't know if it's weeks or days, but whatever. It's a little difficult to make that comparison between people who were vaccinated just after 3 weeks and they might have very high titer compared to people who from whom you're looking after 6 months. So, and then the numbers, when you look at the numbers of people who were naturally infected here, we have more than 89, whereas there's only an N of 20 in the vaccinated group. And if you further break that down, it's 14 from Moderna and 6 from Pfizer. So the numbers are so small that based on that, to make a conclusion or to vaccinate at global level is, it's a little surprising. And this is just, again, very narrow way of looking that if you take those B cells after infection, can they multiply if you were to stimulate them? And they're trying to just show that in B cells from vaccinated people sort of do what B cells from naturally infected people can do. But again, we are looking at a very narrow aspect and in a very limited context. So if you look, going back to that elephant story. So, but when you put it back in its full context, then it doesn't really bear out. So, of course, the media has been very good at highlighting certain things and, ignoring, or even at the cost of very severe adverse events, highlighting the benefits, which to me has been pretty shocking, that they were able to recruit people who would say that despite having adverse events or losing their tooth, they were happy that they got the vaccine. So we have all of these different sound bites that have been going around, and it's just, it's been pretty mind-boggling to go through this experience. And of course, the narrative in terms of what the vaccine could achieve has also shifted. So the first was that it's going to prevent infection. And when they saw that it wasn't preventing infection, then the CDC changed its message to say that, oh, vaccine breakthrough cases are expected. And then it was that the easiest thing to do was to stop collecting any breakthrough cases, which they did in May of 2021. CDC stopped collecting any data on breakthrough cases unless people with breakthrough infection were hospitalized or they died. So there are different ways to change that goalpost or sort of tweak the data in the way that suits their narrative. But that's not science. And finally, long COVID is not that unique either. There are many infectious diseases that can cause or long haul symptoms. We know that Lyme disease is one of those. We know there are certain diseases that are not prevalent in US, but in other parts of the world, such as dengue. They can cause very long-term effects. We know mono can. So COVID is not unique in causing long-haul symptoms. The other part that's been a little distressing to me is the rapidity with which we've seen publications in COVID-19 field. And sometimes that makes me question whether they are robust and reproducible. So just to give you a flavor, this is a site where we can do searches for using keywords in our area of interest. So in this case, if I just put SARS or SARS-CoV-2, as you can see, from 1911 to 2003, there were a total of 1,800 publications. And in 2003, when the first SARS broke out, there was a little blip and you see some publications. But suddenly in 2021, we have nearly 40,000 publications. And then between October 2020 and August 2021, we have another huge surge. It's impossible for anyone to be able to keep up with this kind of literature. And then you wonder where all that is coming from. So again, just to give you an idea that when the first SARS epidemic happened in November of 2002, it spread to about 33 countries. And this is, it was thought that it originated in the Chinese wet market. But from the time it was first reported, to the time that the virus was actually isolated was over a decade. But from the time in November 2019, COVID-2 was first reported in the US, and we had our first publication in 2020. So we received January 20, accepted within 9 days. It's unheard of in our field, but at that time, because of emergency, because of whatever, it was thought that this data needed to be published. We needed to let the community know that what could be the potential cause of this pandemic. And similarly, you see several other papers that were submitted and published and accepted within 3 to 7 days. In this case, this particular paper to me is extremely surprising that it was accepted in 3 days, because of the nature of the work that it's describing is extremely hard and cumbersome and takes months and years to actually get a structure of a protein. And in comparison, you'll see here is another paper which is very similar to looking at a crystal structure of another virus. And in this case, it took almost 9 months before the paper was accepted. So it is a little disconcerting that these papers are being published and accepted in a time frame in which I think it's not easy to be sure about their rigor and reproducibility. So in here, what I want to emphasize is that some of the preclinical models that were used, such as in the monkeys, this data is from a total of 4 monkeys. And here, these monkeys were given or infected with SARS-CoV-2 strain from a German traveler returning from China. But they say that these monkeys did not get any overt clinical signs of actually having the disease. So now, if you use this as a model and give mRNA vaccine as a therapeutic in a model where you actually don't have an infection or clinical symptoms that resemble humans, then what are you studying? I mean, if in the first place the infections are or the symptoms are very mild, then obviously it will give a false sense of security that the therapeutic is working. So here is the data from the non-human primate model, where again N is 4, and they find that compared to the young monkeys and older monkeys, the nasal titer is much more. And this is the distribution, but really the issue remains that the numbers are very small. It's not a good model to study coronavirus infection, just because these monkeys just don't get any severe disease. So these mRNA vaccines, this is a review published in 2018, have been trials with this has been going on for over a decade, and against different viruses as listed here: HIV, rabies, Zika, and influenza. And here is Moderna's trials listed against Zika influenza virus. And in 2017, this was on the clinicaltrials.gov. I was able to pull the publication that described the phase 1 trial against influenza virus in human, and this was published in 2019. And it didn't go past phase 1. They had 124 unsolicited adverse events reported, which some of them are listed here. This study was finished in 43 days. They had 2 ways of delivering the vaccine, intramuscular and intradermal. The intradermal was stopped very quickly because of high number of deaths noted in that route of delivery. So, but the mRNA vaccine trial for influenza didn't go past phase 1, and it lasted only for 43 days. FDA itself has had many cases where they've had to either stop the trials, or the phase 3 trials had very divergent results from what was seen in phase 2. But of course, we never really had a true phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 trials for COVID vaccines before they were given to the population, or mass population, or mass vaccination. So here we have an example where HSV2 vaccine was not efficacious. It was reported to be efficacious in phase 2, but didn't pan out in phase 3. It's even though it's recognized that research findings that are probably wrong are cited more than the robust one, probably because the ones that are wrong, they have very flashy titles, they have very flashy interpretation of data. And so because the narrative is so good, the peer review is not very rigorous, because we all like good stories, we like good endings, we like narratives that help us feel better. So similarly, any scientific findings that that gives hope, unfortunately, does not go through the same rigor as findings that may not be as good sounding, if you like. So, of course, fear is what makes us behave in manners that are sometimes not good for us. So this is my sort of take-home message, that when hope is greater than fear, then we can bring about change, which is for better. But when fear dominates hope, then we go for change that is actually worse for us. So we are coming to an hour, and I want to just take the next 5 minutes to talk about this recent study that came out from the VA veterans. I think they examined nearly 5 million records, but this is the media coverage of that study, and this is the headline, that a massive new study confirms vaccinated people are still at risk of long COVID. And then there's this fine print, or not so fine print, which says vaccines remain a great way to avoid long COVID by reducing chances of infection in the first place. But they're covering a study that actually says that this is not true at all. So this is the soundbite given: vaccines against COVID-19, while protective against hospitalization and death, may not be great at preventing long COVID. So yeah, even though they are giving you this message, they still put this in under the main headline. So I'm not able to reconcile how you can just say here that it doesn't protect you against long COVID, and yet it will reduce chances of infection in the first place. It's a little beyond me. But here's that paper which was published in Nature Medicine. And it basically says that vaccines are not preventing you from getting an infection in the first place. And that other studies have shown that people who are vaccinated, and if they get infected with SARS-CoV-2, their viral load is just as similar to people who are unvaccinated. And this study further says that vaccines don't prevent severe disease or death. And they also don't reduce your risk of getting, if you do get long COVID after being vaccinated, your adverse events or your symptoms can be worse than people who are not vaccinated. So I'm not going to go through the whole study design in this, but it's available for people who are interested. And the conclusion from this study was really that their findings suggest that vaccination before infection confers only partial protection in the post-acute phase of the disease. And that reliance on the vaccine as a sole mitigation strategy may not be optimal to reduce long-term health consequences. Now, this is in their abstract, but if you actually look at the data, it's again hidden if you have to go to their supplementary figures or supplementary tables to find what were the adverse events reported. And it's there for people who want to look at it. But in terms of, it's a really interesting study that I give them credit that they have at least tried to be as thorough as possible. But their finding doesn't give me hope about the vaccine, because they do find that if people who are vaccinated get long COVID, then their risk of getting post-acute sequelae from COVID is much worse than people who are not vaccinated. And there's a whole list of symptoms that they have given. And their conclusion really is that the burden of death and disease experienced by people with breakthrough infection is not trivial. So in giving false hope to people about these vaccines' efficacy and safety is not the right message in my mind. And finally, this other human challenge study that was done by people from Imperial College in London, basically they exposed about 34 young healthy people who were not vaccinated to SARS-CoV-2, and only about 18 of the 34 developed mild to moderate symptoms. And what they again found was that in people who got these mild to moderate symptoms, spike protein had a very small part to play in terms of evoking immune responses. There were other parts of the viruses that also were causing you to make antibodies and providing protection. So there are several viruses and bacteria that are airborne and can cause disease, but in the past we never have to have had any mask mandates for any of those diseases. And of course, some of them are pretty, they are around all the time. So what's the point being that we have an immune system to take care of these things, and by wearing masks, you are basically depriving that training to happen. And would that be more detrimental is something to keep in mind. But masks have their place, of course, when working in the lab and preventing direct exposure from happening when you're working with huge doses of these viruses. We do wear masks, so they have their place, but the place is not out in the open, and place is not when you have other other factors in place. So I'm going to just say that we recognize that there is contribution of human and mankind in climate change. Is there a contribution of human kind or man in disease and health? And has our activity also changed how pandemics have become so much more common? Because when you look at history of pandemics, ever since they've been recorded, we had either plague or smallpox, and the number of years between those pandemics were anywhere between 300 to 400 to 500 years. But of late, we see them every 5 years, or now at this point, we have maybe a monkeypox epidemic, we have other epidemics that are going on. So is some kind of activity that is, are we responsible for this more frequent epidemics that are happening? So there is the physical toll that we take from these, and there's the mental toll. And of course, the mental toll can be a silent killer and is not that easily quantified. So science should not be consumed in real time. It's evolving mostly because we don't know all the parameters. And so we look at things in, sometimes that may appear out of context. Sometimes we look at things that we know or we have only limited information about. Therefore, science seems to be evolving. And really answers depend on the questions that you're asking, and controls are extremely important. You cannot do these kind of scientific experiments without controls. So at this point, if I can take questions and answers before I go to my survey results. And when I go to my survey results, I would like you to stop recording.
Do we have any questions? First of all, thank you, Aditi. That was just an amazing review. I really appreciate what you've done for us. That was a lot of work, and it was fantastic, and put everything into great perspective and brought back a lot of memories for me from my medical school days, which I've forgotten a lot of it. Do we have any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I sent 2 citations in the chat screen. Hi, I'm Jay. Good chair, thank you very much. Amazing. I actually brought this up with Avi Nath, the concept of retrograde exoplasmic transport of mRNA from injection site in deltoid into CNS. So I'm suffering from multiple neurotropic sequelae as well as cardiovascular. So I'm very interested in this, and as the rest of the community. And I was just wondering if you had any comments on that, especially in view of central immune-mediated inflammatory process. Whether or not this might represent something that is additionally more threatening to CNS than viral infection because of the mRNA platform and its ability to be transported via exoplasmic flow, and whether or not that's even been considered. And then finally, the other thing is I just read the NAS paper on long COVID, and I'm like appalled that there's absolutely no mention whatsoever of concern for vaccine-mediated immune disimmunity. It's just amazing. But anyway.
Yes, Jay, you bring up many good points, and unfortunately, there's not been that much done in the biodistribution, right? So again, I have those slides, but what Pfizer and Moderna presented in terms of looking at biodistribution or where other uptake can happen was from very few animals, 3 to 4 animals. But more importantly, they actually didn't do an uptake with the mRNA construct. They used in my mind, what is a pseudo experiment, which can make it look really good, but it's not really using mRNA. So where all can it go? Who knows? Can axonal transport happen? It could happen. What also could be happening is this concept of, we talk about, so sometimes when the viruses infect, so for example, HIV is that in that category, that once it infects, it goes dormant, right? And it goes dormant for a number of years. And then there is some other trigger that happens that makes it get activated, and then you get full-fledged disease. So it may take a number of years for that to happen. Shingles is another example where you've had chickenpox, the virus then just sort of goes dormant, and in 10% of the people globally, some event, most likely it's a stressful, acute stress that then causes the virus to get reactivated and causes shingles. So it's possible that in some subset of people who've gotten this vaccine, if the dose was very high, like I said, because of the dilution problem and things like that, maybe you have other viruses that were, they've gotten activated and could be causing some of these neurological symptoms. In addition to, like you pointed out, that the spike protein itself is being ascribed as the cause of giving long COVID. And here we are asking the vaccines, whether they're mRNA vaccine or the recombinant DNA vaccines, to be making spike protein. Constantly they're making spike protein. And we, like you said, we don't know where all they're going. In different people, they can be targeted to different cell types, and depending on the efficacy of that particular cell type in making the amount of protein, we don't have that control either. So the protein, that amount of protein that can be made in neuronal cells may be different from the amount of protein that could be made by, cardiocytes or myocytes or whatever else. So it's a complete unknown. And there is just no work to try and understand that. It's hopefully it can be done and it should be done, but it's possible.
So in individuals affected by vaccine alone without live virus or infection, there's abundant research like Fernandez et al. In Cell that very elegantly demonstrated inflammatory mediators in murine models. In CSF, I think there's like 10 different inflammatory mediators that are responsible for myelin dysregulation and neurotoxicity. There's no virus whatsoever. This is all related to spike protein and immune-mediated inflammation. So we don't need to have reactivation of other latent viruses. In fact, we don't need to have virus at all. All we need to do is have mRNA associated, spike antigen, and then everything else just becomes a cascade, and we're stuck with post-acute sequelae of vaccination, PAS vax. There's no virus at all. It's just mRNA and its expression. So that's the big elephant in the academic scientific world. I mean, just look, I don't know if you've had a chance to review the NAS paper, but I combed through it, and every mention of vaccine is only about vaccine mitigating. By the way, I don't know how you're going to show vaccine attenuate or mitigates risk of long COVID if it actually is causing long COVID, sequelae. So you're mixing that. The two are offsetting each other. But anyway, I'm going to let other people jump in. There's 49 people on the call, and I don't want to hog the channel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here's another question from ID. ID, do you want to ask the question? I don't know who that is. Or I can just read it. I'll go ahead and read it. I've been in touch with someone who had severe back pain after Pfizer. MRI indicated bone marrow replacement. After looking at your first slides on the immune system, is it possible that mRNA changes the immune cells in a permanent way? I'm no scientist. Maybe my question makes no sense. In my case, I'm diagnosed with CNS inflammation almost 8 months.
It's an open question, and it's a very valid question. We really don't know how these mRNA are modulating any of the cell's functions. So it's been shown that these mRNA can actually be reverse transcribed and get incorporated in our genome. And if that's happening, most of the time, our genome is riddled with what we call line elements, so long interspersed, which are all viral elements. And so the viruses have a way of navigating that we don't fully understand. Can they modulate our stem cells? Can they modulate our immune cells? Obviously, the immune cells and immune cells are in some ways, they are getting trained from the viruses and bacteria, right? That's the whole point. And the viruses have to come up with strategies to evade the immune cells. So can they modify immune cells, or can they get into the bone marrow and modify? I don't know. I think they may not be able to get into the bone marrow, but can they, once the immune cells engulf the mRNA vaccines, can they modify them? Probably, and I think it's been shown that these vaccines persist for a long time. The vaccine mRNA persists for a long time, even though it was initially thought that they would be cleared out of our system within 2 weeks. Yes, John has a question.
Yeah, my question is essentially two-part, because just based on what I'm experiencing myself, primarily neurological, most of the first-line therapies that I've been researching on and have been consulting on with doctors would be corticosteroids, IVIG, or plasmapheresis. That having been said, and just based on the nature of those particular therapies, IVIG in particular, one of the main worries is once you stop that type of therapy, depending upon the mechanisms at work causing these symptoms, it could basically bring you right back to square one. Based on what I heard here, if prospectively we can essentially be turned into spike factories, maybe for one, the question is, hypothetically, would those first-line therapies not even be advantageous for permanent relief, number one? And number two, are there any existing ongoing points of research, any studies ongoing right now to study the nature of how this proliferates in the body over time?
So the second question first, I think there are people who are studying as to how if the vaccine can do an RNA-dependent RNA replication. So it basically, even though you say you gave, let's say, 10 micrograms, can your cells make copies of it and make more of that? And I think there have been some studies that hint that it's possible that it can happen, which would be really concerning. And so I completely agree. And that's why I said when you have a weapon that's extremely dangerous, you don't deploy it without fully understanding the consequences. So this technique is so powerful. And then that's why the viruses use it. And they've used it for more than 4 billion years. And they are very adept at using it. We are not. And instead of being arrogant about it to say that we fully understand, we need to recognize that this is a dangerous weapon that we are dealing with, and need to hit the pause button right now to not do any more damage and understand what's going on. The second part, or your first part, which is whether those therapies might work, It depends on what those IgMs and IgGs are against. If they're against spike protein, maybe they can squelch and take away the spike, and that may help mitigate, as long as there is no more mRNA remaining that will make more spike protein.